Very good. So we're now officially live. Oops, didn't want to do that. Let me shut my door. So you still having flooding issues in Tennessee?
Yeah. Yesterday, well, today is Thursday, so it would have been Tuesday evening. I know where I live at. It came a flood. So
No.
yeah, thankfully it's pretty today, but it's cold.
Oh, I wish I could say cold.
I hope everybody can hear me. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to allow everybody to get in. We opened the webinar just a few minutes early. So if you'll just kind of sit back and hang out, we'll get started here soon. Okay, I think we've got everybody in. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I am with the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. We're going to go ahead and start so our speaker has enough time to go through his presentation. Of course, we're not going to go through his bio that's listed on the site, so we can have enough time for everything. And I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Mark Stadala. Mark?
Jennifer, you said my name correctly. Yoo-hoo! So good morning, everybody, and welcome. I am Mark Stadola. I'm the Probation Fellow for American Probation and Parole Association, and I am speaking to you from Phoenix, Arizona, where it is going to be 93 degrees today. I wish I could say I'm happy about that, but it's a sign that we're going to be hitting the hundreds once again. In addition to all the nasty COVID stuff we had in 2020, Phoenix had the hottest summer on record. So it just was a little slice of heaven having to deal with all that. So anyhow, I'm glad you're here. And here is the plan. Over the next 70 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to you about what we refer to as really the emerging issue of drug impaired driving that we're seeing in this country. And when I say emerging, it's really because, I think primarily because of the legalization of recreational marijuana and medical marijuana for that matter. We're finally starting to pay more attention to the fact that when we're talking about impaired driving, it's not just alcohol. We're talking about all sorts of different substances. So my plan is to kind of give you, first of all, state of the state, if you will, of what we know about alcohol impaired driving, what we're seeing. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stats that we're seeing in Tennessee. Then I want to talk to you about some of the challenges that are unique to drug impaired driving. And then I'd like to leave you, knock on wood, with some practical information in terms of how you can best address this and look for this on your caseloads. So I am totally fine with questions being asked in real time on the chat line. So I'm going to try to do my best to kind of keep an eye on the chat line, and Jennifer's going to do the same, so that if there are technical issues, she can deal with that. And if there are questions related to the presentation, between the two of us, we might be able to find, get those questions answered. And then also I'll have some time at the end as well. So that's what we're looking to do. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, just a little bit of, very little bit of pandemic humor for you. Border Collie working from home. I'm sure you can all relate to that. I have not actually traveled. I'm going to turn off my video here. I've not really traveled since February of last year. So I feel your pain if you've been working out of your house, or maybe it's not pain. You might be enjoying it. So as I mentioned, these are some of the areas that we're going to be covering over the next 75 minutes. But what I'd like to do is start off with some photos. And there's a little bit of a method to my madness here. What you see in this picture is a vehicle. This is in Northern California, that managed to find itself on the second floor of a dentist's office. And fortunately, that office was closed for the day. But you know, it takes a special skill to find your vehicle on the second floor of a building. The reason I bring this up is this was actually one of the first times where the news media was recognizing this as drug impaired driving. Oftentimes, these things kind of get wrapped under one umbrella, where everybody assumes that if there's an impaired driver, it's because of alcohol. Well, in this case, this driver had been under the influence, I believe, of fentanyl, and I assume hit a curb or something, which left his vehicle in that particular location. Now, I've been living in Arizona for most of my life, but I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and a friend of mine sent me this picture of, as you can see, it's an SUV that managed to pancake itself into the side of a house. And I have to tell you, it was the newspaper article was pretty interesting, because the owner of the house indicated that, yeah, he'd heard something in his bedroom and thought he should check it out. And that's what he found, yet another flying car. And the driver of this vehicle acknowledged that probably he had smoked a little bit, his words, not mine, a little bit too much marijuana, which led to this crash. And then finally, I want to share a picture that I think is absolutely iconic in looking at the face of drug impaired driving. And just a little bit of a backstory here. This took place in Ohio. The driver of the vehicle and his wife went to their dealer's house to get heroin. They determined that they couldn't wait until they got home to use. So they used at the dealer's house, and the end result is they both passed out in their vehicle. But the real focus of this photograph is what you're seeing in the back seat of that minivan. And that is the 4-year-old boy that was forced to go along on this ride and was put in obvious danger by his parents. And this picture really went viral. And, that old adage about a picture being worth 1,000 words, this to me speaks not only about addiction, it talks about the impact of addiction and certainly impaired driving to individuals, to families, to this little boy, obviously, and to communities. So this is really what we're faced with when we are looking at these challenges before us. So let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing when it comes to driving under the influence of alcohol and some of the challenges we have, but also some of the progress that we've made. So let me give you some numbers. 2019, which is the last reporting year, there are a little over 1 million individuals in this country that were arrested for DUI. Now that number is fairly static. It may go up or down by 50 or 60,000, but on average, it's about 1 million people a year that are arrested for DUI. Now, I will tell you, this number has nothing to do with the number of impaired drivers on the road. It has everything to do with law enforcement budgets, law enforcement priorities. When budgets go down, then you might not have as much of a response to doing, say, DUI saturation patrols or DUI stops as you would under other circumstances. So that number is not tied to the number of people on the road. Other thing I want to draw your attention to, 2019, 10,421 alcohol-related fatalities due to crashes in this country. Now, notice I don't use the word accident. When somebody gets loaded and they get behind the wheel of a car, that is 100% premeditated. So anything that happens after they turn on that ignition is 100% on that driver. So 10,421 people killed in these crashes. Typically what we see is a BAC of about twice the legal limit of 0.08. And let me draw your attention to this bullet on the bottom. 111 million drunk driving episodes occurred in 2018. Now that's not 111 million drivers. That is 111 million episodes. So conceivably, I could have somebody that was on my probation caseload that drove 5 or 6 times during the course of the day under the influence of drugs and/or alcohol. So that's really where that number comes from. So folks, you look at the bullet at the bottom, you look at the bullet on the top, and you really get the message that we are just touching the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the number of people who are driving under the influence of something on our roadways. Now, I want to give you just a couple other numbers here. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has used a statistic that typically individuals drive about 80 times under the influence before they are stopped for drunk driving or drugged driving. And Dr. Ed Latessa has suggested that a much more realistic number would be about 200 times in urban areas and about 2,000 times in rural areas. And when you think about it, especially in rural communities, barring a crash, it's much easier for somebody to drive from point A to point B undetected because we just aren't going to have the same type of police presence in rural communities. So I'm going to give you some good news. Good news is that the number of drunk driving deaths in this country have dropped by well over 50% since 1982. So there are lots of reasons for this, which I'll get into in just a couple minutes. But as you can see, when you look back over the last 40 plus years, we've seen a pretty significant drop in this population. I will tell you this, a big part of this has to do with social norming and people by and large understanding that you don't drink and get behind the wheel of a car. So we have made some progress there. And just a quick example of social norming. In 1991, about 56% of drivers in this country wore a seatbelt. In 2019, about 93% of drivers wear their seatbelt. That, my friends, is social norming. People recognizing that those old myths that, well, if you wear a seatbelt, you could get trapped in your car, that we're really kind of past that. So there has been progress. Here's one of the challenges. Over the last 10 years, 11 years actually, we've seen these numbers really plateau. And what we found is about 1/3 of all traffic fatalities in this country are alcohol or drug related. So for a first world country to have numbers like that, it's really very much of a damning indictment that we still have a long, long way to go. And as I do in every presentation, I want to leave you with three numbers before I move on. First number is 400,000. Since 1982, there have been over 400,000 people that have been killed in drunk driving crashes. Second number is 214. Of those 10,421 individuals that were killed in crashes in 2019, 214 were children. And the last number is 115. Of those 214 children, 115 were passengers in the car being driven by the drunk driver. So you could really make the case that they were hostages in the vehicle being driven by that drunk individual. So why have we made progress? We've gotten a little bit smarter in terms of what the laws look like in addressing impaired driving. We've recognized the seriousness of this. We have used high visibility enforcement. We're looking at countermeasures that work, and that could be things like ignition interlock, a lot of the alcohol technologies and drug technologies for that matter that are out there. We're doing a better job of assessing and targeting those people that are high risk impaired drivers. 2/3 of the people who get a DUI in this country are one and done. And by that, I mean they never get a second DUI. It's those individuals that don't learn the first time, the second time. The record for DUIs for priors that I'm aware of is 56 priors. So those people that don't learn 56 times about the dangers, that's our target population, especially when it comes to probation. We're better at assessing for this risk, and we're better at treatment. Back in the day, the adage was just follow the bottle. And if you can just get somebody, force somebody to stop drinking, then our problems are solved. And it's not quite that easy. Public education, again, that social norming piece are all impacts there. So what you're looking at here are DUI arrests in Tennessee. This is from the FBI from 2015 through 2019. And so you have to think that, all right, if 2/3 of these individuals are one and done, then you can assume that about 6,000 people that were arrested for DUI in Tennessee in 2019 are going to be that repeat offender that is probably coming to a caseload near you. And then finally, these are DUI fatalities in Tennessee, 2015 through 2019. As I mentioned, the average is about 1/3, and actually in 2019, it was about 29%. So as you can see here, your numbers are a little bit under what that national average is. And just to put this in a little bit of context, the states that typically have the highest percentage are Texas, North Dakota, Montana. They're usually in the very high 30s or low 40s. And the state that typically has the lowest is Utah. In 2019, about 16% of fatalities traffic fatalities were related to substance use. So let's talk about what we're seeing with drug impaired driving and why we know that this is becoming such a significant issue. So this is a map that's the most recent one that I could find that is showing those states where recreational marijuana is legalized or medical marijuana is legalized, and essentially what that looks like. Now, the states here that you see in yellow are states that had some sort of ballot initiative related to marijuana on their ballots. And as you can see, Arizona was one of those states. And for those of you who are willing to think back to our elections, I have a hard time doing that, just with all the controversies. We had some very, very tight elections in Arizona, but when it came to legalizing recreational marijuana, that was not the case. Over 60% of the voters in Arizona voted to legalize marijuana. Now, we're a fairly conservative state. So you had libertarians voting for this. You had liberals that didn't want to see people incarcerated voting for this. And obviously you had a smattering of potheads that were part of that number as well, but it won resoundingly. And in fact, all the states that had some sort of ballot initiative had this their their initiatives passed as it related to marijuana. Now, since the elections, some of you may have read yesterday, New York State, their legislature legalized recreational marijuana. That's supposed to go into effect, fully in effect in 2022. In March, New Mexico, their legislature has legalized recreational marijuana. So bottom line, folks, is the train has left the station. There is big money behind recreational and medical marijuana. And a lot of these large corporations are funding these ballot initiatives. I've also been told that this is something that nationally the legislature, Congress is looking to address. So I would not be surprised if in the next 3 or 4 years we have recreational marijuana legalized throughout the country. Not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying the wheels have been in motion on this for quite a long time. So in order to really address what marijuana, what drugs look like in your jurisdiction, a lot of this should be looked at on a local level. In most states, the way drugs look like in one part of the state might look different than in another part. You may have an opioid issue, for example, in central Tennessee, where it might be meth in eastern, or marijuana or other drugs in the western part of the state. But usually wherever those trends are, you're going to see reflected in what we find with impaired driving. So let me give you an idea of just how significant this issue is. One of the challenges that we have in trying to get our head around this is the fact that there's really inconsistent information that goes from the states to the federal government in terms of collecting information. So for example, when we look at testing drivers who are involved in fatal crashes, that testing can range from less than 10% in some states to over 90% in other states. So we have found that there's real inconsistency in testing these drivers. The other challenge is you could have one county in Tennessee where they are they're testing, say, for 4 different drug families in a fatality crash. And another county may be testing for four drug families as well, but 3 of those 4 match the other counties. So all we can do based on this inconsistency is take the data that we do have and try to draw conclusions from that, which leads to this next slide here. So what you see here is individuals who have been tested for both drugs and alcohol in fatality crashes. The bars on the left are alcohol, the ones on the right are marijuana and other drugs. So if you look at the light blue column on the left-hand side, these are from tests from 2006. And what you see is in 2006, 41% of drivers who were tested were found to have alcohol in their system. And then if you look at that same color bar on the right, about 28% of those individuals had drugs in their system. Now, if you look at the white bar, which is the 2016 report, about 38% of drivers tested had alcohol in their system, and almost 44% had drugs. So what does this mean? What it means is for the first time, we're now seeing more individuals with drugs in their system than with alcohol. So there have been some significant changes. This next slide kind of gives you a breakdown of what was found in their system, the different types of drugs that were found. And the other challenge that we've seen is how these drugs are used. Now, this is an example of from roadside surveys, and this is something National Highway Traffic Safety Administration does every several years, where individuals voluntarily provide information or a test in exchange, usually for a $5 gift card from Starbucks. It's amazing the power of a Starbucks gift card that somebody would pull over and be willing to volunteer this information. So what they do is they have this broken down from weekday days and weekend nights. So if you look at the bottom column, to me, there's not really much of a surprise here. And these are individuals that indicated that they had been using alcohol. So about 1.1% indicated that they had been drinking during the day. Doesn't mean that they were drunk, but they volunteered that they had been drinking. And what you really should not be surprising is about 8.3% said that they had been drinking a weekend night. So Friday night, Saturday night, you're going out for dinner, you're going to have a drink, you go to a game, something like that. That number really isn't very surprising either. In fact, to me, what's surprising is I think it's pretty low. But let's take a look at marijuana. Weekday days and weekend nights, those numbers look pretty much the same. So what does that mean for us in probation, in the courts, and law enforcement? What it means is that unlike alcohol, consumers of marijuana consider this to be the anytime drug. So time to go to work, time to fire up. Lunch break, time to fire up or down a gummy. You could use it in any different time. And so one doesn't really look much different from the other when we're looking at how marijuana is consumed. So, among other things, from a law enforcement perspective, we might be just as likely to find somebody using marijuana at 10 in the morning as we would at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. 1/3 of marijuana users are, according to the CDC, are daily users. So similar in some respects to what we find with those repeat DUI offenders. It's about that 1/3 that doesn't learn the first time. So polysubstance use is really one of the core issues that we are seeing with this population. And what we have found, and this is important to remember, is when it comes to polysubstance use, 1 + 1 = 3. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. Drugs and alcohol, for example, have a synergistic effect. So it's not like if somebody's drinking and they smoke marijuana that it slightly enhances that high. It can have a significant impact on the ability for somebody to be to their impairment. So I have one question here I'm going to try to jump on. Previous research shows impairment from cannabis use impacts judgment and reaction time several days after use. Seems that in assessing damages and legal concerns, that culpability would be assessed as a result. How do different states or insurance companies address confusion around these issues, or do they? That's an excellent question. To my knowledge, Keith, they don't. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of marijuana, short-term, long-term, in just a few minutes. And I'm hoping that that might be able to answer your question. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. So let me talk to you about a study that took place it's a very robust study that took place in a number of countries in Europe. This is back in 2012, where they were looking at crash risk associated with drug use. And what they found in this study, that using marijuana and marijuana alone increased crash risk, easy for me to say, anywhere from 1 to 3 times. And typically what studies have shown is sunny day scenario. And by that, I mean, somebody's driving from point A to point B. There is no weather issues. There's nothing else going on. There's not a sharply increased likelihood of a crash. However, how many of us drive in a sunny day scenario like that? Let's have a dog suddenly rush across the street, or let's have a rainstorm come up, or any kind of weather issues, or a driver in front of us that suddenly slams on his brakes. That's where you see the real difference with marijuana impairment. So looking down this chart, as you see other drugs that are involved, benzos, coke, et cetera, that crash risk increases. But where the real extreme danger is alcohol mixed with other drugs. That's where the crash risk goes up from 20 times to 200 times based on mixing alcohol with marijuana, any of these other drugs. So that is where we find the most extreme danger, is that polysubstance use with these drivers. Now, one of the things, and this won't be the last time I'm going to say it, but it will be the first time, is we can never assume when we have somebody who is arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol, that alcohol is their only drug of choice. And I want to cite actually 3 different studies that came to the same conclusion with really, really different test subjects. So they did a study in Miami-Dade County, Florida. They did a study in Dane County, which is Madison, Wisconsin, my alma mater. And then the third study was in Orange County, California. And what they did was this. They took individuals that had been arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol, and they then tested these same individuals for drugs. Now, what we found is that law enforcement only detected alcohol in their system. And what we found in these studies is in about 40% of all these populations, when they did drug tests, about 40% of these individuals had 1 or more additional drugs on board in addition to alcohol. So why does this matter? Well, among other things, if we have somebody on our caseload and we're making the assumption that alcohol is the only issue, we might not be testing properly. We might not be informing treatment of what exactly is going on with these individuals. So the bottom line is this can really hamper our efforts in terms of how to best approach a particular individual. Now, for law enforcement and for prosecutors, and perhaps for the courts as well, that 0.08 is the holy grail. We have been studying alcohol in drivers for decades. We know how to detect it. We know how to prosecute it. The courts know what to do when it comes to sentencing. But the important thing to remember is these are the only crimes where the investigation stops more often than not always, but more often than not, when you get that 0.08. Drug impaired driving is much more difficult to detect. It's more difficult and much more expensive to prosecute. Getting lab results can take, depending on your state, can take months, which can slow down the process. And there are even challenges when it comes to juries understanding the significance, say, of driving under the influence of marijuana. Because there is such a lack of understanding of marijuana and oftentimes misconceptions from the general population about just how significant a danger marijuana can be when it comes to impaired driving. So you're all familiar, I'm sure, at least those of you who are over the age of, say, 40, with the two gentlemen in this picture, Mr. Cheech and Mr. Chong. And they oftentimes in their movies would connect getting stoned and driving. And typically what you would see in their movies is they would be driving about 10 miles an hour on the freeway. And the perception is that the best way to determine if somebody's driving stoned is they're driving way under the speed limit. Interestingly enough, the most common reason for law enforcement to stop a driver who's later found to be stoned is that they were speeding or driving aggressively. So that whole myth of driving under the speed limit is just that. So some of the perceptions that we have to be dealing with on our caseloads and quite frankly in the general population when it comes to impaired driving are that, number one, driving under the influence of drugs is not a serious problem. It is, as those statistics just showed you earlier. I'm fine to drive when I'm stoned. I drive better when I'm high. This is a perception that a lot of everyday marijuana users have, is that they are much more attentive when they are driving under the influence of marijuana than if they are not driving stoned, which is not the truth. That may be their perception, but it's not the reality. There are no laws against driving under the influence. There are actually laws in every state when it comes to driving under the influence, not just of alcohol, but any kind of substance. Law enforcement can't tell if I'm high. Drug recognition experts, which I'm going to be talking about in just a minute or two, absolutely can tell if somebody's driving under the influence, and they can tell more often than not what specific substance they're using when they're driving under the influence. And then my personal favorite is it's better than driving drunk. Now, I don't know about you, but I had never been in a situation where somebody has said, you have the choice between driving stoned or driving drunk. Which is it going to be? I think there's that third option out there that, hey, maybe I can just drive sober. But I think sometimes people have a hard time kind of breaking through that mentality. Now, this is a survey that is about 6 years old. It was a Pew survey asking people about what they consider to be major risks for driving on the roadway. And as you can see in the top line, about 80% said driving under the influence of alcohol is a very, very serious issue. But look at marijuana in particular. About a third, a little less than a third of the people polled said marijuana is not a serious issue. And then about a third said it is serious, and about the equal number said that's not much of a problem. part of the issue is perceptions of what marijuana is. And oftentimes people have the perception of, well, the marijuana that I smoked in the 1960s wasn't that big a deal. Well, that's not marijuana you can even find anymore. So I think the perception of what the drug looked like 30 or 40 years ago is where some people really kind of get confused in terms of what the real potency of these drugs look like. So let's talk about some of the effects of different drugs on our driving behavior. And by the way, I am happy to give this PowerPoint to the powers that be in Tennessee so that they can share this with you. But what you'll see here is probably not too surprising that the impact of different drugs, just in general terms, what it does to you and how that would then relate to somebody who is driving. So for example, with our stoned friend here, these are the typical signs of impairment when somebody is under the influence of marijuana. Eyelid tremors, slower, deliberate speech, more relaxed inhibitions. I've seen some videos of individuals arrested under the influence of marijuana. It's pretty amazing what they volunteer to the law enforcement officers, perhaps thinking that, again, that there's not a crime to drive stoned. So you look at some of these signs of impairment, and let's connect this with driving. So poor attention to task, time and distance perception. Law enforcement have told me that sometimes they will detect somebody driving under the influence because they will stop maybe 40 or 50 feet from a stop sign. Again, that distance perception, poor speed maintenance, poor lane tracking, steering corrections, and then the level of impairment increases with dosage. And there's a difference in terms of how a novice marijuana user is going to respond versus a daily smoker. And this can be, in some respects, the same as what you see with alcohol, that a dose of marijuana that might put me in an emergency room could be a walk in the park for somebody who is a daily smoker. So all these things are factors. Now, so New York State yesterday legalized recreational marijuana. And as I mentioned, New Mexico did it this last month. And one of the challenges is, how do states write policies? And as you probably know, Colorado is kind of ground zero when it comes to recreational marijuana. They were the first state to legalize it. But what you see typically in policies is that the user can purchase up to, more often than not, it's up to 3 ounces of marijuana for their personal use. Well, just to put this in perspective, 1 ounce of marijuana equates to about 60 joints. And again, this is not that 4 or 5% THC that we see in the 1960s. In fact, if you ever went to a dispensary and asked for marijuana with a THC level like that, they probably wouldn't laugh in your face, but I think as soon as you left the dispensary, they would. You can't buy anything under 7 or 8% in a dispensary today. So 3 ounces of marijuana is 180 joints. That's a lot of getting high, right? The second thing that our legislatures typically allow is that an individual can grow up to 3 plants, marijuana plants, for their personal use. Now, what I tend to think of a plant is a clay pot and a marijuana plant that looks kind of like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. Here's an example, and remember, we're talking about big money behind selling and marketing marijuana, and we're talking science behind the development of the product. So this, my friends, is one marijuana plant. So you probably may see that gentleman who is waving behind that one plant. Now, according to the law, this individual could grow 2 more of these for their own personal use. Now, that's enough marijuana probably to supply a small town for a couple of weeks. So maybe I'm being too conservative when I say that, but it gives you an idea of how this product is being developed and how it's being marketed. Now, this is a picture of a dispensary in Colorado that was opened before they legalized recreational marijuana. So this was a dispensary specifically for medical marijuana. So you can see from this building, it's not exactly a inviting place. In kind of looking at the surroundings, you can get kind of a sense that this is probably not a very nice neighborhood. Um, this is what dispensaries look like today. So if you look at the woman on the left, you probably would not make the assumption that this woman is a stoner. I mean, for goodness sake, she's wearing a lab coat. That in and of itself shows me that she's probably very much of a professional. So you look at these other pictures of these dispensaries. They put a lot of money into it, very obviously. They're very inviting. They look very clean. Almost the one on top looks like you might imagine it being a jewelry store if I didn't tell you what it was. Why is that? Now remember, those daily marijuana users will probably go anywhere to get their marijuana. It doesn't matter if it's a dump or if it's a fancy place. The reason these places look so nice and so inviting is they are all about getting new customers. And folks, those new customers are you. They are looking to bring in new individuals who maybe smoked in college or a little bit in high school, or maybe never smoked, but they are curious about the product. And maybe they're thinking, hey, well, I'm going to have a party on Saturday. It would be fun if I bought some gummies and we could all try those out. But it's important to remember that this is all about bringing in new customers. Now, what does that mean for probation? It may very well mean that we're going to start seeing people who find their way on our caseloads that don't have much, if any, arrest history, which oftentimes is the case for DUI alcohol cases. We may find some of the same excuses with this population. For example, and I know any of you who dealt with a DUI alcohol case, you've heard, I only had 2 beers. Cops are out to get me. I'm not a criminal. I'm not like these other people. So stay tuned. You're probably going to be hearing, I only had 2 hits. The cops are out to get me. I'm not a criminal. I'm not like these other people. I just smoked some marijuana. My friends smoke more than I do. Blah, 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 blah. But this is the new world when it comes to marijuana. This is a picture of a drive-through dispensary in Colorado. Nothing like connecting drugs and motor vehicles. So as I mentioned, the products have changed. That is Elon Musk on the top, the man who builds rockets and likes to smoke doobies on radio shows. The other issue that we have is detecting different types of drugs is much more complicated than just looking at alcohol. Again, we've got decades of research when it comes to alcohol and driving, but the information we have on drugs can be much more limited, and impairment can vary by type. And it's not necessarily just going to be a given that a law enforcement officer is going to know, well, this person's under the influence of fentanyl or whatever the drug might be. So because there's so many different drugs out there, testing can be much more of a challenge. It can be as simple as changing one compound for a synthetic drug, and our ability to test it via drug testing it has become impaired. We can no longer get an adequate test. So a lot of this can be kind of cat and mouse in finding this. Now, the other issue, and this in some respects is speaking to the question that was asked earlier, and that is presence of a drug versus impairment. So if somebody tests positive for marijuana or another different drug that can stay in your system for a longer period of time, it does not mean that that individual was impaired at the time that they were stopped. That's why having law enforcement that serve as drug recognition experts can play a significant role in determining if that impairment is due to a particular drug at a particular time. And part of this is how these drugs metabolize in our system. So for example, marijuana metabolites can remain in your body for 30 or more days. But when we're talking about the actual impairment, it can go, it actually, the window when it comes to smoking is really about 30 minutes, and the impairment can last like 2 to 4 hours, but that window is actually relatively short. Unfortunately, we do not have the ability to determine that somebody that there's not a number that can tell us that somebody is impaired like we can with alcohol. Alcohol, again, we've got that holy grail of that 0.08. Marijuana, there is not a number. So there is no BAC for THC. Let's remember that. So I will tell you early on when we were in the process of responding to legalized recreational marijuana, we were trying to come up with different numbers. And this is kind of like telling the story of how sausage is made. But in some states, they said, well, let's make it 10 metabolites. And another legislator would say, no, let's make it 1. And what did they do? They would split the difference and essentially say, let's say it's 5. Well, 5 means nothing. It's nothing more than a number. Somebody could be significantly impaired with a lower number, or at least outwardly not appear impaired with a higher number. So we don't have the ability to match a number with any kind of a specific test yet. Now that may change because just as there's lots of money going to legalization, there's lots of money going towards detection. And I'm going to get into that in just a little bit. The other thing that we have to be aware of is the method of ingestion matters. And more often, I think you're going to be finding that smoking marijuana is going to be passé, especially when it comes to new customers who are using this that wouldn't smoke a cigarette if you paid them $1 million, and they wouldn't smoke a joint for the same reason. They don't feel that that is a healthy thing. But be aware of all the different ways that this product can be ingested. So let me just kind of walk through some of these. Picture in the upper middle is an individual who is vaping. When you're vaping marijuana, you're not going to have that telltale kind of weedy, raggy kind of smell that you get when somebody is smoking a joint. Individual on the right is dabbing. So they're using a marijuana concentrate, which I'll touch on in just a second. But we have marijuana protein drinks. We have all sorts of different ways to ingest it. And if you look at the picture in the middle, what you're looking at is a marijuana inhaler. Now, I don't know about you, but if I saw somebody in the lobby of a probation office with an inhaler, I would assume, well, they probably have asthma or some sort of lung condition that requires that they use this, when in fact they could be actually getting high right in front of me. So for the purpose of detection, these things are really, really difficult to really get our head around in looking at the different ways to ingest. Now, here are some other examples. There are marijuana patches. So there are transdermal ways to use the product. You have a what I would assume somebody has sinus issues if I saw them using that device on the upper right. And folks, in the middle of this picture, you see marijuana suppositories. So you could have a client that tells you that or you overhear them saying that they got stoned off their ass over the weekend. That might not be just a figure of speech. That might be how they're using the product. So we have concentrates, and they certainly don't look anything like marijuana, but these are concentrates that can have anywhere from 75 to 90% of THC. So they are obviously very, very strong. If you see the crystalline in the lower left-hand corner, I've been told that law enforcement oftentimes assume that that is meth. And then when they test it, they find out that it's actually THC. So these are these kind of super user products for somebody that is looking for a very potent high, because that's what they're going to get with these products. So edibles are more and more common. Hopefully you're seeing these particular types of products going away. In the early days of legalization, you had marijuana products that were knockoffs of, say, candy bars. And what's going to happen if those are sitting around in an apartment somewhere and you have a kid? You guessed it, that kid is going to consume it and probably be in a world of trouble. So typically what you now see in dispensaries are, if they're edibles, they don't have that kind of advertising, and they try as much as is possible to make it more difficult to open, to kind of child-proof it. Obviously, we don't know if that's always successful, but that at least has been kind of how they have been attempting to get around this. Now, edibles have a different type of impact than smoking, and let me get into this a little bit with you. These are kind of the doses that you would find with edibles. Typically, if you were to order gummies, they're around 10 milligrams of THC. Obviously, you can get higher or lower, but this gives you an idea of what the volume of THC does for the individual that's using it. And there's a term referred to as green out, and that is when somebody has consumed too much marijuana. So that can result in rapid heart rate, nausea. These are oftentimes the people that will find themselves in an emergency room. They can just have, paranoia. They can have mental health issues related to consuming too much of this product, which oftentimes happens with new users that don't know just how potent these products are. And let me, excuse me, give you an example of how this can oftentimes happen. So if you went into a dispensary and you told a bud tender, I am a new user and I would like you to tell me how I should be consuming an edible, that bud tender would probably tell you to break off one of those squares, which is considered one serving, break that square in two, eat about half of it wait about 45 minutes to an hour, and if you don't feel anything, then finish the rest of that square. So what are we? We are Americans. And what do Americans want? Americans want immediate gratification. It's more often likely that somebody may eat half or all of that chocolate bar if they're not feeling what they are expecting right away. It can take 45 minutes to 2 hours for an edible to take full effect, and then the high that you receive tends to last longer than if you were just smoking. So this picture is a PSA from Colorado, warning people about the delayed effect of using an edible that can take about up to 2 hours for it to affect you. And you do not want to be behind the wheel of a car when something like this is going to happen. So as you can imagine, in Colorado and other states where it's legal, we're no longer shaking our finger at you saying you should not use this product, you're going to have terrible problems. It's been legalized. So the messages, which oftentimes are humorous, the messages out there are, in Colorado, they have PSAs saying, if you want to grill and get high, you can do that, but you can't get in your car and go get a new can of propane when you're high. So the message is really stay at home and do not ever get behind the wheel of an automobile. So let's talk about DUID enforcement and what that looks like and some of the challenges. So a scenario like this, if you're law enforcement and somebody is vaping right alongside of you, what are they doing? Are they smoking cigarettes? Are they smoking tobacco? Are they smoking weed? We don't know. So the stereotypical sight and smell and sounds of somebody getting stoned are no longer as obvious or as common today with all the technology used to ingest these products. Some of the challenges that law enforcement have is the training can be time consuming to, certainly if you want to be a drug recognition expert, that can take about 160 hours of classroom time. So in other words, about a month of training in addition to all the other training requirements that law enforcement has. So bottom line is that is a big time commitment. So training can be difficult to come by. And oftentimes, and I find this interesting, we find that many people in law enforcement who are trained as DREs, they tend to be more the go-getters. And what happens when you really are a go-getter, you get promoted. And what happens when you're promoted? You're no longer boots on the ground. And those skills that you've been trained on, you may not be able to actively use. So that's a challenge. Delays in collecting a sample can take a long time. And again, with some drugs, such as marijuana, it metabolizes very quickly. If you need a blood draw, that can require a warrant, that can require a lot of time. And states can vary. Some states can take 6 to 9 months before they get test results, which obviously is dramatically slowing down that process of getting somebody through court, getting somebody in for a trial. Lots of things can happen during that period of time. So there are different types of training. Drug recognition experts are that's that holy grail. The other two, SFSTs and ARIDE, are drug detection. It takes less time to do the training, but it does give information to law enforcement if they stop somebody and have determined that it may not be alcohol that's the primary cause of impairment. But again, the bottom line is all these take time, all these take money, which are obviously very finite resources. So officers need more tools, especially as we're looking at polysubstance use. And there are some tools that are available. Oral fluid testing is, relatively speaking, is kind of the new kid on the block. I don't know if you're seeing this in Tennessee. I know in Michigan, they've done lots of studies with this, and these devices are pretty readily available to law enforcement. This is what these technologies look like. So they could be in the back of a squad car. And essentially what you're doing is an oral swab that goes into these devices. The test can take maybe 5 to 10 minutes before you get a result that indicates that that drug is in somebody's system. Now, again, presence does not necessarily mean impairment, but if we're looking at that corroborative evidence of what is going on, this is, again, an excellent tool in the toolkit. So if somebody is an officer is suspecting that somebody is under the influence of something, this test would help corroborate this. And folks, I think we're going to be seeing these more in problem-solving courts, where if we want, again, the level of evidence is different. If there's presence of the drugs in the system, that's all we need because of the fact that we need a lower standard to determine this at the post-sentence level. So don't be surprised if this is going to be coming to a problem-solving court near you. So some of the other technologies, they're still working on cannabis breathalyzers that would actually test active THC. It is not court ready yet. And intelligent fingerprinting is another tool that is out there. I have seen this. They tend to be kind of cost prohibitive, but again, it's another option that is out there. So let's talk about probation in the time that I have left. So this is Stabby the kitten, and as you can see, there is a goose warning Stabby that he's on probation and he needs to put away that knife. Now you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with this presentation? And the answer is absolutely nothing, but I do like Stabby the kitten, and as probation people, I figured you probably appreciate that as well. So what are some of the tools that are available? Let me jump ahead here. There are DUI-specific risk assessment tools that are effective for both alcohol and drug use. What we found is that there are 5 major risk factors when it comes to recidivism with DUIs that apply to both alcohol and apply to drugs. So prior involvement in the justice system, more prior DUIs somebody has, the more likely they are to get a future DUI. Non-DUI involvement in the justice system, these are people who are getting lots of traffic citations as well as other criminal involvement. They tend to be more likely to have a future DUI. Polysubstance use is a red flag. Mental health and mood adjustment problems. This is significant. 33% of men, 50% of women with multiple DUIs have a diagnosable mental health condition. And among those, PTSD and depression are at the front of the list, which is oftentimes why we see individuals, military veterans who end up in the system with multiple DUIs. So there can be a correlation there. And then finally, resistance and noncompliance with current and past involvement in the justice system. Those people that have not complied with the ignition interlock, which by the way is a huge predictor of future DUI, have not complied with treatment, have not complied with probation, are more likely to get a future DUI. And these risk factors really look the same when it comes to the drug impaired driver. So let me again jump ahead. I am running low on time here. There are a number of different DUI specific assessment tools. that are available, and this is going to be a shameless plug on my part. I do training on the IDA, the Impaired Driving Assessment, which was developed by APPA. If you're interested in getting training on this tool, the tool itself is free, the training is free, and there are many jurisdictions that are using this to determine if somebody should be in DUI court or not, and also to serve as a roadmap when it comes to what the priorities should be with supervision. So the other one, CARS, Computerized Assessment and Referral System, is also free, and I'm happy to give you more information on that. The real strength of the impaired driving assessment is determining risk, and the real strength of CARS is determining what specific treatment needs there are. So let me know if you need any information on this. But the bottom line is we're using these assessment tools really to drive our decision making with this population. The bottom line is, again, we can't assume that alcohol is the only thing on board. And folks, I don't care if you have the 80-year-old man who's on probation, who's been drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon beer since the Korean War, don't assume that that is the only drug that is on board. So drug impaired driving, should we be using ignition interlock? There is no downside to using this because, again, they're polysubstance users, so they can flip from one drug to another. So if somebody is arrested for driving under the influence of marijuana, don't assume they don't drink as well. Now, these are expensive populations to supervise. So if you have discretion to use ignition interlock, then that's something you should really discuss with your team. But there is not a downside to using this given the kind of history, drug history that we see with this population. Testing considerations, strongly recommend that you test for as many substances as possible, as early in the process as possible. And here are some of the examples of some of the drugs that we might be looking at testing. With the idea being better to be proactive and find out what's going on with these individuals than to find out a year later that they're using a drug that we didn't even suspect. Is this more expensive? Yes. Does it need to be done very often? No. Maybe once a year, but again, as early in the process is what we recommend. Again, let me jump ahead. Where do we place these people? If they are drug impaired drivers, do we place these people on in a drug court? Do we place them in a DUI court? And what our friends from National Center for DUI Court say is these individuals should be placed in a DUI court, regardless of whether they're using alcohol or drugs. Reason being is we are looking at the behaviors that the drivers are exhibiting, and that's where we want to be starting our programming. Now, treatment might look a little different for this population, but that's really where your treatment provider would be making those decisions. The bottom line is you want to be focusing on the behavior and not just the drug use. So I'm going to leave you with the same picture that I started with, and that's really to impart how important your work is, how valuable your work is in changing the lives of individuals that we see in the criminal justice system. So let me also jump ahead to my contact information. And please, if there's any information I can provide you, don't hesitate to send me an email or give me a call if there's training you're looking for or if there's research I can help you with. I am more than happy to provide you that information. So a couple questions here. Are oral fluid tests able to be sent to a lab or as an instant test? These tests really serve as an instant test for the individual, for law enforcement. And again, it's that corroborative information that helps determine what those next steps would be. ETG is a type of urinalysis test that is used. We use it now for alcohol. We have a larger window. It used to be back in the Stone Age when I was a probation officer, alcohol had about a 12-hour window. Now we have about a 48-hour window that we would be looking at for detection. And sometimes with heavy users, it might be longer than 48 hours. So I got in 3 minutes under my deadline. I'm really proud of myself for that. So I would like it if you have any questions, any additional questions, please fire away. And if you have questions, again, maybe a little bit later, feel free to, again, send me an email or give me a call. So is there anything I can try to answer before we wrap up? I'm looking at the Q&A screen.
Well, Mark, I don't see anything coming up in the chat box either. So we can give it a few more minutes if you'd like.
Well, that means either I answered every question or I left everybody so totally confused that they can't even form a question. That's been known to happen as well. So please feel free if down the road you do have questions regarding anything I covered or additional information, feel free to give me a call or a text or send me an email. But not seeing anything else, it sounds like we're ready to wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you all. And just one other shameless plug, you need to tell your supervisors that you need to learn more about the DUI problem. And the best way for you to do that is to attend the APPA conference in Boston in August. So if you need me to write a note or anything for you, I'm happy to do that. I'm semi-kidding. I wish you guys all the best, and I hope to see you next year in Tennessee. I would just love that. So thank you all.
Thank you, Mark.